Welcome to the BOOMCLAP podcast, where culture and conviction collide. I'm Rita Rogers.
And I'm Cecily Dickey.
Today we have a great episode for you. We have Dr. Frank Turek on with us to talk about a lot of things. We get into several things, including apologetics, as you would expect when we have Frank Turek on our podcast. But we had him on specifically to talk about elections and voting. We're not going to keep you there the whole time, but he is very well spoken on this as to why Christians should participate in conversations around politics and actually voting itself. So I don't know. I enjoyed the conversation greatly. Cecily?
Yeah, I did too. And I mean, we knew we would. We were actually messaging right before recording, saying to each other, this is a guest that we're really excited for. Just because he is so clear on everything. He's so confident on everything, but he's still just totally humble. And he's done a lot in his life. And it's just a really interesting conversation.
It was an interesting conversation and fun. He has a lot of energy, which I enjoy, which brings me to, so during the episode, he brought up natural law a few times because he was talking about some issues and he was saying you don't even need to bring Christianity into the conversation necessarily to feel that this is wrong. You can just look at natural law. And it reminded me a lot of the episodes that we've done with Katie Faust. We've done 3 of them now.
Yep.
And I actually meant to ask Frank afterwards if he has heard of her, because if not, we should connect them. They would
for sure
get along really well.
Yes.
But anyways, you guys, if you enjoy this episode, you would definitely enjoy the episodes with Katie Faust. Also, fiery conversation where she just tells it like it is. They remind me of each other from that point, but also the fact that she is a Christian, but she approaches pro-child politics. She approaches all of the them before us, children's rights issues from the aspect of natural law. She can be a Christian, but speak to it in a way that everyone, despite their belief system, can understand why it's important. Yeah. So we'll put those maybe in the show notes as well. Cecily, write that down. So
writing it down right now.
Maybe we can put her episodes in the show notes as well, so you guys can find them back easily. I do know one of them, our latest one with her, was 151. So I'm going to read to you about Frank Turek a little bit. If you don't know who he is, Dr. Frank Turek. He is the president of crossexamined.org. He is a dynamic speaker. You will find that here, an award-winning author, and he travels the country presenting powerful and entertaining evidence for Christianity at churches, high schools, secular college campuses, and online. I told Cecily as I was looking at his bio, I'm like, this guy's done so much. And he has the shortest bio. He's just... I don't have time for a bio, let's just get on with what I got to do. But he also wrote the book. I have it right here. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This book, I was looking at the copyright, is 20 years old. It was 2004, but it will never go out of style. It's such a good book to keep on hand to reference, especially if you have children. I mean, for adults, but especially if you have children and are trying to explain to them the tough things of Christianity where they come to you with these hard questions. It's a good reference. So
he's got excellent books. So make sure you check those out because he just makes everything so understandable. Whether he's speaking or writing, he makes everything understandable. Yeah.
Okay. Last thing before we get into the episode, please go leave us a review if you haven't done so yet. Go click the 5-star button wherever you listen. Click the follow button so that our next episode populates onto your phone wherever you listen. The reviews are crucial for us, you guys. They lift us up and keep us going, but also they propel our podcast to new listeners. And that's so important for us. So anyway, leave us a review and let's get into the episode. I know so many of us are looking for ways to keep our families healthy while avoiding the doctor's office. And one of the ways that Cecily and I have both found to do this is homeopathy. We have both benefited from homeopathy and specifically Remedy Collective. They have been one of the ways that we have learned to care for our family. It's helped us not only with their remedies, but also the learning process. We each have their first aid kit, and in that first aid kit comes a guide with a list of problems that describes what remedy to use for what problem. It's been so helpful to have on hand. So if you guys are interested in learning more about homeopathy, but also having remedies to keep on hand for you and your family, go to remedycollective.com/BoomClap podcast. and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 10% on your order. All right, Frank, we are so happy to have you on with us today. Just a little background to how this podcast came about. Cecily actually mentioned having you on recently, but I think about a year ago, I had saved a video from you about voting during election time and why it's important for Christians. And so we do have a lot of questions that are not about voting, but that is the driver for having you on specifically now, because it's election season. It's politics season, I guess you could call it that as well.
It might be helpful to define what we even mean by politics, because I think people, they're told never talk about politics and religion, when politics and religion are probably two of the most important things you should be talking about.
Yeah.
Politics just deals with a group of people coming together and determining how they're going to treat one another in a legal sense. And of course, religion most often has to do with also how we're going to treat one another and how are we going to live in the afterlife if there is one, and how do we even get to this afterlife? So those are very important subjects we ought to be talking about. And for some reason, a lot of Christians think they ought not be involved in governing themselves or governing at all. And I find that quite odd. Are only atheists qualified to run the country? Where do we come up with that idea?
Yeah.
It's silly.
Oh,
Truly.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, because if Christians aren't involved, where does that leave us?
Well, we wouldn't even have a United States if Christians weren't involved in politics. And Canada too, because the Christians have always been involved in establishing nations in the West. So to say that Christians ought not be involved would be to say you shouldn't even have a United States or a Canada, because they were founded by Christians. Now, they didn't make Christianity obligatory, but it informed how they set up their governments.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's very true. And I'm curious, and maybe you don't even know this, but when do you think that switch happened where it went from like Christians were heavily involved in politics and setting up how countries were run to all of a sudden it's like this, like, oh, we couldn't possibly do that. That's either below the call of a Christian, or we'd be imposing something that we shouldn't, and people don't like that, and it gives Christians a bad name. So when do you think this switch happened? Or am I wrong? It wasn't a switch, and it's always kind of been there.
No, hasn't always been there. During the establishment of the United States, there were what was known as the Black-Robed Regiment, which were pastors who preached overtly political sermons that actually established the Declaration of Independence and a new country. So Christians were always involved from the very beginning. And, 52 of the 55 founding fathers were all Orthodox Christian believers of some kind. And the other three may have been deists, but they were, most of them, members of Orthodox Christian churches. And so from the very beginning, the country was established by Christians. It began to erode with Darwin's theory of evolution, when people in the Christian church didn't quite know how to answer it. And so instead of engaging with the culture, they retreated from the culture and set up their own little Bible colleges and seminaries and separated from the culture. And of course, that left the culture to the non-religious folks, the secularists, and they trained up a whole new generation of people who ultimately made it to the Supreme Court. And then when the Supreme Court began ruling the Bible and prayer and religion out of the public square, and then Lyndon Johnson in the 1950s tried to pass an amendment that called the Johnson Amendment, which said that Christians who are part of churches, particularly pastors, can't endorse political candidates. That has seeped into the psyche of pastors around the country. And so now people erroneously think Christians ought not be involved at all.
That's a really interesting history. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And you talked about it really started to shift with an ideology, and that ideology was evolution. And so one of the questions questions or talking points that we had for you is regarding an ideology, and that's Marxism. So, Donald Trump has accused Kamala of being a Marxist. And this is, Rita had highlighted on Instagram after the debate, and I know this is coming out much, much longer after. It's just that's a really important point that she is. So for a lot of people, though, that responded to that, they're like, well, a lot of people don't actually know what that means, or, but I think this is hugely important for what's going on right now. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is Marxism? And relating to that, a little bit about critical theory as well.
Well, Marx really was more of an economist, if you will. He thought that the upper class people were controlling everything and the lower class people were being oppressed, the proletariat and the worker class. And of course, the ruling class were the oppressors and the oppressed were the working class. And he thought the working class ought to rise up. And eventually this would lead to a communist system where nobody owned the property. We'd all live with an equal amount of resources, and we'd all live happily ever after. Now, of course, that goes against human nature. Human nature will not allow a Marxist ideology to actually succeed because we need to be incentivized to work. If we're not incentivized to work, there's a free rider problem where many people will just live off the state and won't work. And actually, that was that was something William Bradford learned when he brought the Pilgrims over in the 1600s. He first tried to do communal farming, and they practically starved to death the first winter. After that, he said, we're going to divide up the land, and you're going to have to take care of your own needs. And they had more than enough food. They had so much food they could share it because people will work if they get to keep a portion of their labors. If they're not enabled to keep a portion of their labors, then they tend not to work. And so Marxism is something that misunderstands human nature, economic Marxism. Now, Kamala Harris, to be fair, is probably not a complete economic Marxist. I mean, she doesn't think that the government's going to own or no one's going to own property. Socialism is where the government takes the control of the engine of the economy. They control all the businesses, that kind of thing. And communism technically means that nobody owns it. Now, that's never really happened. But so she leans that way, but she obviously wouldn't think that nobody's going to own businesses or the government's going to own all the businesses, as socialism would say. But where the kind of Marxism she buys into, and unfortunately most of the Democratic Party now buys into, is this oppressor-oppressed bifurcation that comes from economic Marxism. That there's a group of people that are oppressed, and then there are groups of people that are oppressors. And if you're in the oppressed category, you can never be morally wrong. And if you're in the oppressor category, you can never be morally right. That's why, for example, you might see people who are, say, identified as LGBTQ siding with Hamas, because Hamas, in this kind of way of thinking, this oppressor-oppressed kind of way of thinking, is supposed to be oppressed. And so are the LGBTQ people. So they stick together, even though if the LGBTQ people went to Gaza right now, they'd be the first people to be thrown off a building.
Yep.
So this identity politics is something the Democrats unfortunately now buy into. And it has little to do with behavior. It has more to do with the condition. If you are one of the oppressors, according to them, you can't do anything right. If you're a Christian, if you're a male, if you're heterosexual, if you're rich, if you are white, if you are a colonialist, as they would describe you, you're an oppressor. And anybody on the other side, who would be any non-Christian, which would include Muslims and Hindus and everybody else, atheists. If you are a minority in terms of ethnicity, what you're Black or you're Indian or you're Asian, although Asians are doing so well now, they might want to keep them out of that category. Or if you're, say, trans or any of these other kinds of LGBTQ, of all, any of those identities, those people, according to this theory, are always right. And we need to take from the oppressors and give to the oppressed. And of course, this is an ideology of conflict. You will never have a common unity, which is what community means, if you pit the citizens within that community against one another based on factors that have little to do with behavior. You can't be redeemed from being white, according to them. You can't be redeemed from being a Christian, according to them, unless you renounce Christ and become a Muslim or a New Ager or something. You know, you can't be redeemed if you identify as heterosexual. These are conditions that you can't change. So there's no redemption. You've just got to continually apologize, and you have to continually take a backseat to anybody who is considered oppressed. This is poison for a country.
Yeah.
And I don't think any Christian should support this. It goes, of course, completely against Galatians 3:28, that in Christ, there's not male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. We're all one in Christ. Now, this doesn't mean that biologically men and women don't exist anymore. It means that we're all one in the eyes of Christ. And Christianity is the cure for this this theory of conflict, which is tragically infecting much of the nation.
Well, Christianity is the cure, right? Like, because as you were describing it before you even got to that part, what was so obvious to me as you were saying, like, we can't be redeemed from being white. We can't be redeemed from all of these different things. Whereas the gospel is like, here's redemption. Are you willing to accept that? Right? So it's just so different. So yeah, Christianity is the cure.
It's so different. And also, if it's an effort to somehow cure racism, which obviously was a factor in our country legally as early as, or as late as, say, 1964, prior to the Civil Rights Act, racism was real in our laws. Now, obviously, it's out of our laws. But if you're trying to attempt to fix racism, you don't fix it by introducing new racism, which is what critical theory does in this oppressed situation.
Yeah.
That's just introducing more trouble. It doesn't help the issue. It doesn't help the people who are allegedly being helped by it, because all affirmative action does is it causes the rest of society to go, oh, you're just here because you're the quota hire, right? Which I think we can make a pretty strong case, if we're being honest, that Kamala Harris herself is a quota hire. She obviously was not the most qualified person to be vice president when she was selected by Joe Biden. There were much more qualified candidates. But since she checked the minority box in several ways, he just picked her as a DEI hire. Now people are looking at her going, you shouldn't even be where you are now. In fact, when people are asked who are supporting Kamala Harris, what has she done? What causes you to say that you think she has a certain number of achievements that qualify her to be president of the United States? Nobody can answer that question.
They don't know.
Because she hasn't done anything except fail at her job to protect the country on the border. That was her role as border czar. She hasn't done anything, and yet here she is.
Yeah.
So
Cecily and I were talking after they debated, like, there's no way they picked her for presidential candidate also, because there's no way any man can win against her in a conversation, because either he's being mean to her, or, it's just like you can't win in a conversation with somebody who is already winning the oppressor situation. So.
Yeah, well, it's not fair to her either, to be honest, because she's viewed more as a figurehead and someone that was put in that job, not because of her qualifications, but for these unchangeable conditions that have nothing to do with her performance, that she's a woman, that she's Black and Indian. I mean, this should have nothing to do with whether or not she's qualified to be president, but those are the reasons they picked her.
Yeah. And one thing also that I think should be clarified, this is like a throwback to old episodes. Cecily, remember the Elites and Innocence episode? Yes. And we talked about that quite heavily for a long time. The fact that these people in the high positions, like, they know what they're doing. They're not really trying to cure racism. They're using race as identity politics. But the small people, just the people of America that are trying to do good, like, they think they're really doing something by following these people who are, putting all these policies in place. They think they're really helping people. And it's like the situation where there's the elites and the innocent people that just follow along.
Well, this race, like all elections, should be more about policy than anything else, because policy is what you elect people to go implement. And if we're too worried about what color skin or what gender the person is, we're missing the point. The point is, what are they going to do once they get in office? In fact, look, to be honest, personally, I don't like either of the candidates at the top of the tickets, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to imagine something, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to imagine that you weren't on social media and you didn't watch TV. So you never see the personalities. You never see Trump. You never see Harris.
Mm-hmm.
You would still be affected by them. How? Not by their personalities, but by their policies.
Exactly.
So you need to really look at the policies to discover how you ought to vote as a Christian. And this is what Jesus pointed out when he was talking to the politicians of his day. The politicians of his day were the Pharisees. Many of them were on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, to whom Rome delegated day-to-day lawmaking authority. And here's what he said to the Pharisees. He scolded them quite sternly in Matthew chapter 23. And this passage is easy to remember because it's Matthew 23:23. And he says to these politicians of his day, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You're tithing your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you're neglecting the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the former without neglecting the latter, you blind guides. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." Now, what's he saying in everyday English? He's saying that these politicians were tithing their spices. They were doing the little things, but they were ignoring the bigger issues, the more important matters of the law. And we're doing that in this country here right now. I mean, we're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, but we won't say don't murder your children.
Amen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Kamala Harris wants to ban plastic straws, but she doesn't want to ban child mutilation. She's neglecting the more important matters of the law. In fact, with regard to abortion, she wants the government to pay for abortion.
Yeah.
So she's got all this nanny state stuff she wants to get done, banning plastic straws, telling people what cars they can and can't drive. But she's neglecting the more important matters of the law. And there's nothing more important than life. The right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so she not only wants to allow people to kill their children, she wants the government to pay for it. That's when the government now is doing evil. It's not preventing evil like it should. It's doing evil. That's a problem.
I wonder, like at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking a bit about how Christians feel this hesitancy to be involved in politics or to even talk about them. Do you think some of that hesitation stems from critical theory bleeding into their belief system, even if they shun critical theory? You know, like, so for example, like, well, I can't say that abortion is bad because who am I to say that? Or even like when you were describing Kamala Harris's policies there, you know, some Christians would say, well, who are we to criticize her for that? Because, you know, she's not a Christian, so we have nothing to say about that. So what would you say to that? Because I hear that so often. And I think it's true in maybe like everyday personal relationships and stuff, but, you know, we're not like holding a non-Christian to the same standard that we would hold a brother and sister in Christ to. But this is someone who develops policy. So can you speak to that a bit?
Well, you're to advocate for the right policies and leave the results to God.
Mm-hmm.
You're not supposed to say, well, that person's not a Christian, so that person can say whatever he or she wants, which they can, but that doesn't mean what they're saying is right or true. And by the way, you don't need the Bible to know that you ought not dismember children in the womb. You don't have to be a Christian to know that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just part of the natural law. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, life is listed first. Why? Because it's the right to all other rights.
Mm.
You don't even need religion to know that you ought not dismember children in the womb. We're not holding Kamala Harris or anybody else to any standard beyond just being a good human being, which means you don't encourage people to murder their children.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in government, you shouldn't allow it, unless, of course, it's there to save the life of the mother. Now, Christians don't seem to understand their scriptures because a lot of times I hear, well, you ought not judge. They don't read the entire passage. Jesus isn't telling people not to judge. He's telling them not to judge hypocritically because he says, judge not lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite. Notice that's a judgment, by the way, you hypocrite. Take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Jesus is not telling us not to judge. He's telling us how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it, then go help your brother. It would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Because it's unavoidable. To say you ought not judge itself is a judgment, right? You're judging people for judging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and everybody's making judgments. Kamala Harris in the debate not long ago said it's immoral to prevent abortion, essentially. By what moral standard is it immoral to prevent people from dismembering their children? It's immoral not to prevent them if you're in the government. Because the number one role of government is to protect innocent people from evil. This is what Paul says in Romans 13, that the ruler does not bear the sword for nothing, meaning the ruler is in place to protect innocent people from evil. And so the number one role of government is to protect innocent people from evil, and that means preventing murder, protecting people from murder. And we know an unborn child is a human being from the moment of conception. Scientifically, we know that. Biblically, we know that. Common sense says we know that. Planned Parenthood has been caught on tape selling body parts from aborted babies. How can they do that if there's not a baby in there?
That's right.
Right? They're pulling body parts out because that's exactly what's in a womb, a baby. So you don't have to be a Christian to know this. You're not holding anybody to any other standard other than just being a good human being to say, don't allow child mutilation.
Yeah, absolutely. So this brings us to legislating morality, which we're talking about right now. But a lot of people say you can't legislate morality, which what I think they mean is you can't change someone's heart, which I would agree. But they twist it to mean like, well, we can't legislate on morality. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was the subject of a book Dr. Geisler and I wrote, our first book back in 1998, creatively titled Legislating Morality. I mean, you always hear you can't legislate morality, but and when you think about it, that's all you can legislate. That's what laws do.
Yes.
Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. The only question is whose morality will we legislate? And when people say that, I say, I don't want to legislate my morality. I don't want to legislate your morality. I want to legislate the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 said the Gentiles don't have the law of the law written on their hearts. And that's what we were just talking about, natural law. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We know it's wrong to murder people. We know it's wrong to rape them, to steal from them, because God exists and those things are against his nature. And we should put those laws into place. If you say we ought not put those laws into place, then you'd have to say we can't have any laws because all laws are legislations of morality. That's what laws do. Now, with regard to what they mean when they say laws can't change hearts, I understand where they're coming from there. That's partially true and partially false. Here's where it's true. Yeah, Martin Luther King famously said this. He said, the law can't force a man to love me, but it can prevent a man from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important.
It is.
Now, tragically, the law for him didn't protect him, right? Somebody assassinated him, but still he was right. Okay. However, the sense where that laws can't change hearts is false is the fact that the law is a great teacher.
Yes.
And many people think whatever is legal is moral and whatever is illegal as immoral. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the United States, 160 or so years ago, we went to war over slavery because there was a large group of people in the United States who thought slavery was morally fine. Okay. Now, 160 years later, how many people do you know who think slavery is morally fine? Nobody.
Yeah, no one.
Why? Because the law changed. Look, we're probably less religious now than we were in 1860. But we have a better moral view. Why? Because the law is a great teacher. The law teaches people right from wrong. The same thing is true inversely with regard to abortion. In the United States in the early 70s, every state law had some kind of restriction on abortion. Now, 50 or so years later, we're about evenly split on the issue. In fact, the country's probably more pro-abortion than it is pro-life. That's why so many of these amendments go down. Because the law for the past 50 years has helped teach people, abortion must be legal or must be moral because it's been legal for so long.
Right.
So we can't give up on the law. All laws legislate morality. Tragically, many of the laws now don't legislate morality. They legislate immorality.
Yep.
Like the idea that you can murder your children, or the idea that you can mutilate your children, or the idea that in the state of California and other states, a child can be taken from the parents to transition them, even if the parents disagree. This is madness, moral madness.
It is. We've said in previous episodes, again, these are major throwbacks, but a lot of what you're saying is bringing just back these memories. We've said previously that people's understanding of morality and what that means tends to follow legislation. So also intrinsically linked. So not long ago, you mentioned the Romans 13 passage. This is something I think that Christians really debate about as well. It teaches us, it talks about government. But I remember very acutely during COVID, I was somewhere and a group of Christians were talking, and one of them said, I just don't understand what people don't understand about Romans 13. It's so clear that we just need to listen to what the government is telling us to do. And I just kind of like, I got to just walk away. So can you help from your perspective, help us understand Romans 13, because people really have differing beliefs about what that means for a Christian.
Well, first of all, God established 3 institutions. The first institution he established was marriage. The second he established was government. That comes from Genesis 9. And the third he established was the church. And with regard to government, in Romans 13, Paul is saying essentially that anarchy is better than no government, that God has instituted government to protect innocent people from evil. Even when Pilate had Jesus before him, Pilate said to Jesus, "Are you aware that I have the authority to kill you?" And Jesus said, "You are right, but you get that authority from above."
Mm-hmm.
What did he mean? That God has instituted government. And what Paul is essentially saying is he's giving a general principle that governments protect innocent people from evil. It's not a universal truth that governments always do that.
Right.
For example, the Nazi government did not protect its citizens, its Jewish citizens, from evil. It actually did evil on them.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese government is doing evil in their abortion policy, if they still have that policy, forced abortion after your first child. So there are instances when the government does evil. What is a Christian's responsibility when the government does evil? The Christian is supposed to civilly disobey. If the government tells you you can't preach the gospel anymore, are you just going to say, well, the government told us we can't preach the gospel, I guess we can't do it? No, look at the biblical precedent. Look what happens when they tried to tell the apostles you can't preach the gospel anymore. What did they say? Oh, we got to obey God rather than men. And this goes through the Old Testament. There are many times that Christians or people who are Jewish at the time, disobeyed what their government told them. What did Daniel do? Nebuchadnezzar says, you can't pray anymore. I'm going to open my window and pray 3 times a day in front of everyone.
Yeah.
Hey, you got to bow down to the statue, Nebuchadnezzar. What did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do? They said, no, we're not going to do that. Throw us in the fire. Right? Of course, God saved them. But they said, even if he doesn't save us, we're not going to bow down to you, King. So there are times when a Christian has to disobey government. Whenever the government tells you to do something that God says don't do, you disobey. Or whenever the government tells you to do something that God says you can't do, you don't obey. Maybe I said that the same way twice. If God or if the government's trying to tell you to disobey God, you disobey the government.
Right. We have a higher obedience.
And this was the problem in COVID. In our country, you know, the liberals are always talking about the separation of church and state, which of course is not in the Constitution. It's a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist in about 1803, where he was telling them, I'm not going to set up a national church. There's a wall between separation of church and state, meaning he didn't want the state getting involved in the church. He wanted the church to influence the state, but not the state to tell the church what to do. In other words, it was a one-way wall of separation. But what happened during COVID? The state began to tell the church what to do. We shouldn't be falling for that again. Mm-hmm. The state does not have the authority to shut down the church or to tell believers what they can and can't do. Now, tragically, under a Harris administration, this is what is going to happen through their so-called Equality Act that they want to pass. There will be men and women's sports, men and women's restrooms, locker rooms. There will be bakers and photographers and caterers who are going to have to use their artistic talents to support same-sex weddings. Any religious freedom you have will be usurped in the name of LGBTQ rights. This is nothing but equality. This has nothing to do with equality. This has basically putting LGBTQ rights, so-called rights, over any sort of religious rights, even rights of conscience. There's going to be doctors that are going to be forced to do abortions. There are going to be Christians that are going to have to, pastors are going to have to do same-sex weddings. This is what the so-called Equality Act is all about, which is not equality at all. Notice that when evil is put forth in legislation, it always has to be called something good. Mm-hmm. The Equality Act or reproductive justice, which means child dismemberment. Okay, they won't call it what it is. They have to whitewash it, and only dirty things have to be whitewashed. Mm-hmm. Only bad things have to be sugar-coated. And this is how Satan works. He comes as an angel of light. Who could be against equality? Who could be against diversity? Who could be against inclusion? Who could be against all of these great sounding phrases like reproductive justice and choice? Oh, nobody can be against those. Yeah, until you really take a close look at them and you realize we've been deceived.
That's what it is. It's deception, right? Mm-hmm. And how, like, when I think of how can people be protected against deception, I think of logic, right? They need to understand logic and be able to apply it. And the other thing is philosophy. And so this is something we wanted to talk with you about, is the importance of logic and philosophy. So can you kind of define and discuss each of those and tell us why those are so important?
Well, logic is a subset of philosophy. Right thinking about reality is what I would call philosophy, and logic is just a subset of it. And that's why we have some courses. In fact, our mutual friend Shanda Fulbright leads these courses that we have called Train Your Brain. We have them for 6th to 8th graders, and another course running right now for everybody else. Because if you've never had a course in logic, you might be easily deceived by certain slogans and certain phrases you hear in our culture. One element of logic is called the law of non-contradiction, which says that opposite ideas cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. So, for example, God can't both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense, right? Either exists or he doesn't, but not both. Or truth can't exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense. It's one or the other. And we use this law of non-contradiction to point out that many of the slogans we hear in our culture are false. They're logically self-contradictory. So, for example, if someone were to say there is no truth, which is a postmodern relativistic claim, you simply ask that person, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth, right? Mm-hmm. Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true.
Yeah.
See, this is a self-defeating statement. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English, mm-hmm. right? You would say, you just used English to say it. Or when people say you ought not judge, what are they doing? They're judging.
Yeah.
Right? It's a judgment itself. Or when people say there are no absolutes, you want to ask them, is that an absolute?
Mm-hmm.
Are you absolutely sure? Right? Or if they say all truth is relative, you're going to say, is that a relative truth? So there are so many self-defeating claims out there that logic will help you unpack these or debunk them by just simply asking a question. You ought not judge. Then why are you judging me for judging? There is no truth. Is that true? Just see how people deal with that, right? I have my truth, you have your truth. Is that the truth? That I have my truth and you have your truth? Is that the truth? Because notice, you're making a the truth claim by claiming, while you're saying it's just your truth. If it's just your truth, why should I believe it? If you're saying it's the truth, well, you just said there isn't any the truth. You just said it's just your truth and my truth. I mean, to say you have your own truth would be like saying I have my own math. It's silly, right? I don't have my math or your math. There's just math.
Yeah. Well, some public education schools would disagree at this point, I think.
Yeah, well, they would disagree, but they would be making a truth claim in doing so.
I'm joking.
So they'd be defeating themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so logic will help you do that. Now, philosophy deals with other things as well as logic, like, is there anything beyond the material, beyond the physical? That would be called metaphysical. Like, for example, do you have a mind, or are you just a brain? Do you have a soul, or are you just a body? Right? These are philosophical questions. How do we reason? How do we know anything? It's called epistemology, right? How do you know? How do you know there's a God? How do you know there's another person out there? How do you know right from wrong? That's ethics. These are all philosophical questions. And where does ethics come from? Where do ethics come from? Is there a standard of objective rightness that we're obligated to obey? That's an ontological question, another aspect of philosophy. Is there a standard outside of ourselves that is right and we're obligated to obey? If so, there is an objective right and wrong. If no, there is no objective right or wrong. And that standard can only exist if God exists. So these are critical issues. They're even critical issues to science. Why? Because if you think about it, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Mm-hmm. In other words, all data needs to be gathered and all data needs to be interpreted. And who does that? Science doesn't do that. Scientists do that. Mm-hmm. And in order to even think about doing an experiment or historical observation, you've got to use philosophical principles. You've got to use the laws of reason. You've got to use the laws of logic. You've got to use moral precepts. Like, for example, when you do some sort of experiment, you have to be bound by morality to report your findings truthfully, right? You don't find morality in a test tube. It's something you bring to the scientific endeavor. And so philosophically, you've got to decide, what question am I going to investigate? How am I going to gather the data? And once I gather the data, how am I going to interpret the data? That's all philosophical. Mm-hmm. That's not scientific. You have to bring that to the scientific endeavor in order to even do science.
Yeah.
And so all of these, and this is probably why every advanced degree you get with a PhD stands for philosophy, right? Philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics, philosophy of history, whatever it is, you have to interpret the data. And that's where philosophy comes in. If you're a bad philosopher, you're going to be a bad scientist. If you're a bad philosopher, you're going to be a bad thinker.
Yep.
If you're a bad philosopher, you're probably going to be a bad politician because you're not thinking properly and you're not interpreting data properly. And therefore, you're coming up with solutions that are not correct. Yeah. Outside of that, it means nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like that's really clearly seen in the scientific community. And again, not to bring it back to the COVID years, but you could run all sorts of tests, scientific tests, but depending on your philosophy would depend on how that was interpreted, right?
That's right. That's why we got so many different opinions during COVID, right? Why did you get, people say, well, trust the science. You go, whose science?
Yeah.
And
The
notice that
trademark
one
science.
side was trying to censor the other side.
Mm-hmm.
This is why Francis Collins, who many people lauded as a Christian, I think is a very bad guy, because he was Fauci's boss, and he and Fauci and others tried to censor Stanford-trained epidemiologists who were disagreeing with their assessment of COVID. Why?
Why?
The censors are normally the people hiding something. The censors are normally the people in the wrong. And if they were to say, well, the reason we did, they're admitting now that, what they were doing was wrong. Some of them are anyway. If they were to say, well, that was the best data we had at the time, that's an argument against censorship. Exactly. Censorship is actually a claim to infallibility.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's saying, I can't learn anything else. I know everything already, so shut up. Science, by definition, is tentative because there's always new information that can come in and overturn an existing theory.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the top scientists allegedly in the country is Francis Collins, and he didn't even obey that basic precept of science.
Yeah.
He went political. And this is the problem. When politics infects science, watch out.
Yeah.
That's what happened. Science went political. The CDC, who for many years, they were a respected arm of our government. Now their reputation's trash. Why? You can't trust them anymore because they've gone political. When they said everyone needed a vaccine except the people coming across the border, you knew it was political.
Yeah.
When they said everyone needed social distance except the people at the George Floyd riots, you knew it was political. Right? When they started to censor people who had a different viewpoint, you knew it was political. That's not science.
Mm-hmm.
That's politics.
Yeah. And truthfully, they had been political for a long time. A lot of people were just shielded from that because they weren't exposed to it. But given my background as a nurse, I was exposed to that political nature quite frequently within the hospital walls. Did you know during the coronavirus years, poison control centers saw a 20% jump in calls related to cleaning products? This is because of the bleach, all-purpose cleaners, antibacterial cleaners that people were using around their homes. And regardless of your fear during that time and your increase in cleaning, a lot of people just in general use these products around their home. And not only are they bad for you to potentially ingest, but they also are absorbing into your skin. Your skin is an organ. This is where Rocasa Organics comes in. They have cleaning products with natural organic ingredients that you can pronounce, that you know what they are, and they are safe for you and your family to use. You can feel comfortable using them. They also have lotions and soaps and just a wide array of products that you can use in your home. I know our house has Rocasa in basically every room now. So go to rocasaorganics.com and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% off your first order. So you brought up PhD for a second. I'm going to skip down, Cecily, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Talking about education there. We both homeschool. And so there's a lot of conversation in the circles we're in about future schooling, like going to college and things like that. And I found your dissection of in your I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist book, like in the beginning of it, you talk about what university means and what it's become. And I found that really interesting. So I don't know if you talk through that a little bit and then maybe just share at least like a short version of your salvation story. And
I'll start there. The short version is I came to faith through apologetics.
Okay.
I always wanted to know if it was true, and I got Josh McDowell books, and I realized it was true. And then I met Norman Geisler after I got out of the Navy, which stands for Never Again Volunteer Yourself, by the way. And he was starting a seminary here in Charlotte, North Carolina called Southern Evangelical Seminary, ses.edu. Still a great place to get trained in apologetics, theology, and philosophy. And so we moved to Charlotte and started attending there. So I came to faith through evidence. With regard to a university really means to find unity and diversity. And the queen of all of the academic disciplines is theology. Why? Because theology takes every area of academic discipline and puts it under one umbrella. How does this all fit? under God's truth, if there in fact is a God. So how does biology and physics and anthropology and psychology and any kind of academic discipline you can think of, how does it fit under the overall umbrella of truth? You don't get that when you go to university anymore. Instead, if you're majoring in a particular field, you take a deep dive into that field. And if you go for a PhD, you become an expert in a very small segment of reality. Like, okay, here's the expert on the mating habits of the South African fruit fly. Oh, okay. Well, that's important. Okay. But if that's all you're studying, you're probably not going to be a well-rounded individual.
Mm-hmm.
And a good liberal arts, in the good sense of the term, education, could bring forth a good citizen. But somebody who just dives into one narrow sliver of knowledge out there and doesn't get a big picture view on even how to interpret what he learns about the West African fruit fly is probably not going to be, probably not going to be a good scientist, probably not going to be a good citizen. So you're supposed to get a broad overview, and then if you want to dive in, you can, but then you can interpret the data you get in that very specialized field in light of the bigger picture. A theologian is supposed to show you how all of those academic disciplines fit under God's truth. And so that's what you're supposed to get when you go to university, but we don't get that anymore.
Yeah.
We get gender studies.
Yeah.
Instead of Department of Religion, they have religion studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As if it's just a novelty off to the side.
Mm-hmm. So how important was apologetics to you? I guess, I think it's very important now, especially as things progress in our world, for kids to be exposed to apologetics as a way to back up their faith in conversation. But how important was that to you to be able to know truth?
Well, for me, I always wanted to know if Christianity was true. I was brought up Catholic because I grew up in New Jersey and it's the law. You're either Catholic, Jewish, or an unbeliever. But after college, when I went into the Navy, I met the son of a Methodist minister, and I was always interested in God. I never got into trouble as a kid. I wasn't like a wild kid or anything. I always knew there was a God because there had to be a first cause. I just didn't know who Jesus was. And it wasn't until I read those books by Josh McDowell, I was recommended them by a friend of mine in flight school who said, hey, you need to get these books. So I got those books and I was like, wow, this appears to be true. Mm-hmm. And then after the Navy, that's when we discovered Southern Evangelical Seminary. Mm-hmm. So it was very important to me. And I'm kind of, look, we're all different to a certain degree, but I'm almost shocked how few people care about truth.
Yeah, me too.
Particularly even Christians. They don't care whether it's true or not. They're not on a truth quest, they're on a happiness quest. They just want to make Christianity work for them. Right? When you read the scriptures, almost every book in the New Testament has something to do with suffering. And you'd go, and persecution. You're going to get persecuted for being a Christian. Yet here we are in the comfy West. And if we get unfriended on Facebook or something like that, ooh, that's smarts. I better not say anything about that again. Mm. We're not really following Jesus. We're just following comfort.
Yeah.
And I think a bigger test for Christians is not poverty, although poverty is hard. The bigger test for Christians is prosperity.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because prosperity can cause us to want more of it and neglect what we ought to be doing as disciples. And look, I count myself as part of that problem, right? How much am I willing to risk for Jesus? How many of any of us are willing to risk for Jesus? We all sometimes play it too safe, don't we?
Absolutely. We've talked about this so many times, Cecily, how just during the struggles of our life, it is, and personally for me, it's been easier for me to feel closer to the Lord when I'm struggling. And when things are easy, that's when you start finding yourself slipping or like, I'm good. I'm good, you know.
Mhm.
And that struggle is helpful in terms of being a Christian. So,
It
all
is.
right.
Sometimes you only look up when you're on your back.
Oh, that's a good way of putting it for sure.
And there are several places in the scripture that talk about the value of suffering, whether it's
Mhm.
James, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, Paul saying that tribulation produces patience, and patience perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. You know, and Paul in 2 Corinthians 4 says, our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us a greater weight of glory that far outweighs them all. And then he says, all things work together for good, to those that love God and are called according to his purpose, so they can be conformed to the image of his son. It doesn't say all things are good. It says all things work together for good. Jesus says, blessed are you when you're insulted on account of me, persecuted on account of me. You will be persecuted, Paul says, if you're a true follower of Jesus. Jesus said, hey, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. Nobody wants to hear these verses. In fact, Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. It's going to divide mother and daughter, father and son. And many people listening to this right now go, yeah, those passages are true. I'm divided in my own family over Jesus. And you ought to be. You should be following him and not your culture or what your family says. You ought to follow what he says.
So we just spoke a lot about suffering. And I would say, from what I've observed, and even in my own life, it can be that the problem of suffering is a big stumbling block for people in choosing to follow God. And it can be just one of those big doubts as this problem of suffering, right? And so when I trace that all the way back to the source, the question often is then, well, why did God create, knowing that Satan would rebel and that there would be all of this evil and that suffering would become so prevalent in everyone's lives? And, here we have suffering to a different degree than they have in war-torn third world countries. And so what would you say to that? Why did God create, knowing that there would be this huge rebellion and these huge amounts of suffering? And thankfully, as Christians, we can know what suffering produces. But for someone who really questions that, what would you say?
I would ask that person, why did they have children? Knowing that your children would rebel at you at some point. Yeah. Inevitably, it's going to happen. You did because you knew that to love somebody is worth any rebellion that they may generate, that they may engage in. And you also knew that because they also had an opportunity to be redeemed. So God creates us, gives us free will. Thankfully, he gives us free will. We're not robots. We couldn't be moral creatures if we didn't have free will. So we can love. Without love or without free will, you can't love. You can't make choices either that are meaningful. The problem is when he gives us free will, he also gives us the ability to do evil. So why is there evil in the world? Because God is love. And he wants to give creatures the ability to love him. But he can also redeem the evil that we do. And that's what he does. He comes to earth, adds humanity to his deity, allows the creatures that rebelled against him to torture and kill him, so he could take their punishment upon himself. And then we, by trusting in him, can not only be forgiven, we can be given his righteousness. Because he's an infinitely just being. He can't just say, oh, forgive them. No, someone's got to pay. Otherwise, he's not just. So he is the one that pays. So I have a whole section in the book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case on Evil. But the short answer is God allows evil because he wants to allow love. And in order to allow love, he's got to give us free will. And the negative part of that is, well, we can do evil with our free will. But the positive part of that is that God can redeem it. In fact, I was at Arizona State last week, and a young kid kept going back and forth with me on why did God create it all and why does he allow evil? And I finally said to him, I said, because redemption is better than innocence. And that was a light bulb moment that he hadn't heard before. In other words, when you're redeemed of an evil situation, the relationship that you have with the person that redeemed you is stronger than it was if you had never broken the relationship. So, for example, I mean, here's a trivial example in business. Businesses know that if the customer has a bad experience with the business, but the business goes above and beyond the call of duty to correct the problem, that customer is more loyal to that business than they would have been if the problem had never occurred. Because redemption is better than innocence. So if you get yourself in an awful situation and somebody rescues you from that situation, that relationship is stronger after that sin that you may have committed than it was before. And we don't sin in order to build a stronger relationship. We're just saying that redemption can do that. Redemption can take an evil and turn it into a good. So we enjoy God more because he has redeemed us than if we stayed in a state of innocence.
Rita, do you have more on the free will and determinism? I know that you wanted to.
Well, that could be like a whole another podcast, probably. Yeah. That's something that's so hard for me to explain to my kids. And even for me to wrap my head around just, how it will say, in the Bible, basically God has shut their eyes or, things like that. But at the same time, like we have free will. And it's like, well, if our eyes have been shut by God, like how do we still have free will? And I have a hard time explaining that to my kids because I can't sometimes wrap my own head around it.
Well, you have to look at the context of the passage. Who rebelled first? These individuals that didn't want to follow God. So God completes the process. It's like what he says in Romans 1, that if you suppress the truth long enough, God will give you over to futile thinking to the point that you have a depraved mind and you're not only doing evil, you're encouraging other people to do evil. That is basically a description of our culture right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, 30 years ago, people who talked about abortion, like Bill Clinton would talk about abortion being safe, legal, and rare.
Now, that was a good impersonation.
Now it's all about shouting your abortion, come to my state, we'll pay for your abortion. It's celebrating abortion to the moment of birth. And even sometimes after birth. Kamala Harris lied in the debate. She's for abortion. And she's for abortion up to the moment of birth, maybe even after. And she wants the government to pay for it. So in that situation where God knows you're not coming back, he may give you up to your own desires. You're now irredeemable. But God knows you wouldn't come back. So he lessens your culpability by taking his presence away. This is why Jesus says in Luke 12, he says, to whom much is given, much will be required. And in the parable about, I'm trying to think of which parable it is, where when the landowner comes back, the vineyard owner, I'm trying to think of which one, it's in Luke 12, but the one that had the instructions and knew what to do and didn't do it is treated with more punishment than the one that didn't know what he had to do. To whom much is given, much will be required. This is just fairness, basic fairness. It's the same thing true with God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Okay, Pharaoh hardened his heart first, and then God completed the process. Right. And by the way, if you know the context of Egypt, you know what Moses was essentially saying to Pharaoh was, by your own theology, you're not going to make it in the afterlife, because in Egyptian theology, in order for anyone to go to the afterlife, they had to have their heart weighed against a feather. And if the heart weighed less than the feather, then the pharaoh or the person would be admitted into the afterlife. If the heart weighed heavier than a feather, it would be consumed by this demon goddess known as Ammit, who was part crocodile, part hippopotamus, part lion, the three most fearsome animals in the Nile. And then that person wouldn't make it to the afterlife. So when Moses is using the language of hardening your heart or hardening Pharaoh's heart, he knows the culture of the Egyptians. And he's essentially saying, you did this to yourself, Pharaoh, and you're not even going to make it in the afterlife because your heart's going to be so hard, it's going to outweigh the feather. You're done. So God wants all people to be saved, but not all people can be saved because they don't want to be saved.
Yeah.
Super helpful.
And so it's not God who is responsible. People have free will. They've just taken the free will to move away from God and rebel against God.
Good.
Yeah.
I had asked my kids, we were having you on, I'm like, okay, all the questions that you asked me, and I'm like, we're going to have to look that up. Like, just give them to me now. But sadly, they couldn't remember very many of them.
Well, if you go to our YouTube channel, there's like 2,200 videos up there. You can do a search because just about every question that your kids probably could think of, someone has asked in the past 15 years.
And
right?
Actually, your book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, I told Cecily the other day, I've had it for a long time and I've never read it cover to cover, but I use it as a resource and I have recommended it to people as a resource. It's so good just, when you do have those questions that need an answer from apologetics, just to go and look up. So
I don't know how to tell you this, Rita, but if you don't read it cover to cover, you can't be saved. Look, I don't make up the rules, okay? I'm just telling you.
Well, I know I shouldn't have admitted that to you, but I did. So
look, I haven't even read it cover to cover. Come on. It's too big.
Funny. That's funny. Okay.
No, it is great, but it's a great resource to have too. So anyway.
Okay, so we're coming up on an hour here.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I think this would be a good place to end the podcast is with this question for you. Our podcast tagline is where culture and conviction collide. So what does it mean to you to live and engage in culture with conviction?
It means that every area of your life, you bring your biblical worldview to. You're not just a Christian on Sunday morning. You're a Christian at home. You're a Christian at work. You're a Christian at play. You're a Christian online. You're a Christian in the voting booth. You're a Christian everywhere. Yeah. And by the way, you're not imposing a religion on people when you say, I'm voting for the pro-life candidate. You're imposing morality, and that's what everybody's doing. The other side is look, the pro-life side in this situation wants to impose continued pregnancy on the mother. The pro-abortion side, however, wants to impose death on the baby whenever abortion's chosen. Those are both moral positions. The only question is, what's the right moral position? You can leave religion out of it. And the right moral position is you ought not murder innocent people. So you have to bring that everywhere you go. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't even have to bring religion into it. That's just natural law. You don't dismember your own children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, the Bible doesn't talk much about abortion because it was unthinkable to the Hebrews. Children were a gift from the Lord. Although thou shalt not murder covers it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So it means being a Christian 24/7 everywhere you go. It doesn't mean I'm going to compartmentalize this and I'm only a Christian on Sunday morning or only at home. You're not being salt and light if your Christian faith doesn't inform how you behave in the public square. You can't be salt and light just sitting at home complaining about how bad your country is. That's not being salt and light. Being salt and light is doing something about it.
Amen.
And following the truth and leaving the results to God.
Very good. And that's how we describe our podcast. So our tagline is where culture and conviction collide. And when we're describing it to people, it's like we talk about a lot of things and it's all through a biblical worldview. So you kind of nailed it for us. Thank you. You never quite know what people are going to say, but you nailed that. So thank you for that. And this was a great conversation.
Thanks for having me on. Send me the link once it airs. We'll put it out.
We absolutely will. Is there anything you want to tell people about where to find you and the things that you do with, you have a lot of things going on. So let us know.
Right. Well, the best place is go to our website, crossexamined.org. That's crossexamined with a D on the end of it.org. And you'll find links to our YouTube channel, which is Cross-Examined, 2 words. We have an app, the Cross-Examined app, which has everything on it. We have a TV show. We have 2 podcasts a week called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So wherever you get podcasts, if you just look for I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, you'll find it. And we cover theology. We cover cultural issues like this, politics, current issues, philosophy, apologetics. Obviously, because a Christian is a Christian in every endeavor. So that's what we believe. And so we take our Christian faith and apply it to all aspects of life.
Awesome. All right, guys, check him out. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay. Love that conversation with Frank. I love having a conversation with someone who I feel like I'm learning from while we speak, which happens with a lot of our guests. But today I was just very noticeable to me that like I'm learning things and I'm also kind of being like shored up in my own, like how to defend my own beliefs. You know what I mean? So really appreciate that conversation with him. You guys, I don't know if you've noticed this, but every episode, twice an episode, we are asking you to leave us reviews because that is just so important to us as a podcast trying to find new listeners. We're so thankful for our current listeners, but know that in order to continue to produce great content, we need to find new listeners and keep growing. So if you haven't done so, please do leave us a review, a rating, share an episode, maybe this one, maybe another one that you love with a friend or a family member, and let them know what you like about the podcast. Just today, actually, Rita had shared something on Instagram, on our BOOMCLAP Instagram, how someone had shared on, I was going to say Instagram so many times, shared on Instagram our recent episode with Katie Faust and had said that the BOOMCLAP podcast is one that, what was the words they used?
Something about like makes you really think. Something to the effect of making you think.
Yes. And it was just so nice. It was so nice for us to hear, like, what is it that you like about our podcast? It's not only helpful for us, but it's
cognitively stimulating. That was the term, which is so much better than making you think.
Yeah. So clearly this listener is very smart. But anyway, we like hearing what you like about the podcast. It helps us make more of that content. And I don't know, it's like, it's just really makes us feel good too. Like, but really it is helpful. So please don't hesitate to do that if you haven't done it yet. We would just be so grateful. So we mentioned Katie Faust is a great episode to listen to if you're looking for episodes like this one with Frank Turek. She brings a very similar energy, but also the last couple of weeks, we had a couple great inserts. We spoke with couple great interviews. I think I said couple great inserts because I was already thinking of who they were, but we had a couple of great interviews, one with just the inserts and one with Dr. Heidi Klessig on brain death. So both super fascinating conversations. If you haven't listened to them yet, you might want to go back and do that. And we are going to continue to bring you great new content this fall. So as always, thank you for listening. If you want to find us outside of the podcast, you can follow us on Instagram at BOOMCLAP Podcast, or you can follow me individually at cecily.dickey or my website, thegracetogrow.com.
And you can find me at ritarogersco.com or Rita Rogers Co on Instagram. Thanks for listening.